Is it time to replace your home's carpet or flooring? Call Sears Flooring to get shop-at-home convenience you can trust. Sears Flooring brings the showroom to you with a wide range of carpet, tile, hardwood, and laminate. And if you call right now, you'll save 20%. Call for a free in-home consultation at 1-888-491-3939. Sears Flooring has many styles to match your home and your budget. Your new flooring will be precisely installed, and your satisfaction is guaranteed. So call Sears Flooring right now and save 20%. Call 1-888-491-3939. Offer ends soon. Not available in all areas. Installation provided by Sears Authorized Licensed Contractors. License information available upon request. Call Sears Flooring. You'll save 20% if you call now. Call 1-888-491-3939. That's 1-888-491-3939. Sears.
Blog Talk Radio.
Now, detonate the reality bomb!
Live from the Future Congress on Emerging Threats and Challenges 2011 in Branson, Missouri. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker. Tonight, we are honored to come to you from the Radisson Hotel and share some of what we are discussing here this weekend. We know that there are quite a few people here today, more than we anticipated, I believe, but we also know that there are quite a few who couldn't be here for whatever reason. And so, again, it is our honor and our blessing to be able to take some of this to the internet tonight. Whether you're listening live or in the archives, thank you for inviting us into your electronic music device. Our guest tonight will be engaging in a free-form discussion over the next couple of hours about apologetics and prophecy. In short, what the Bible tells us about what is coming and why we can trust what the Bible tells us about what is coming. Our guest, the host of the Nowhere to Run podcast on the Revelations Radio Network, and possibly the world's first debunkumentarian, a man who's produced a number of excellent videos that you'll find online, including the most recent David Icke Debunked, Chris White. Chris, it's an honor to have you here.
It's always good to be with you, Derek.
And gentleman who's one of the contributors to the excellent new release from Defender Press, Pandemonium's Engine, and the man behind the Logos Apologia website, Chris Putnam. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Derek. It's great to be with you again.
So the topics of discussion that you fellows are bringing to the table, tell us a little bit about this. Chris Putnam.
Topics of discussion here at the Future Congress?
Yes. What are you bringing up?
I'm doing a workshop. It's called Tactics for Defending the Faith in a Fallen World. And my ministry calling is apologetics for the most part, and this is actually training Christians to engage in the public square of ideas. And it's a tactical approach that I learned from an apologist whose name is Greg Kokel of Stand to Reason out in California. And he's got a radio show that's on every Sunday for 3 hours. And I took this training from Greg's program, and it's so useful with engaging non-believers. His approach is that we're all ambassadors for Christ, as it says in Paul wrote it to the Corinthians. And as ambassadors, we have a duty to engage tactically with these people and to persuade them to the truth of the gospel. And so what I'm teaching is a method that helps people to stay in control of their conversations with unbelievers and not get taken advantage of, and kind of make them back up their claims, why they don't believe, and to kind of bring it to the head for the truth of the gospel.
We'll get more into some of those specifics here as we go along. But Chris White, your work has delved deeply into the apologetics realm, but also you've been doing some research lately into prophecy.
Sure. Yeah. The last conference at the Politics Religion spoke on prophecy there. The two presentations we'll be doing here, one of them has a lot to do with apologetics. It's called Zeitgeist History Rewritten, dealing a lot with what's sometimes known as the Christ myth theory or the Jesus myth theory, also known as mythicism. Popularized recently by a really, really popular online movie called Zeitgeist. So I deal with a lot of that. Unfortunately, a lot of the recent debunkings about that are, in one sense, obsolete. There was nothing wrong with them, but they have been countered, and the counter of those has not been sufficiently answered. And so dealing with a little bit of that. And in addition to that, the second one is A lot of my ministry has been apologetics based, but for the purpose of ministering to the New Age. So the second one does look at the New Age and some of the things that I've discovered along the way about it, and it's called the New Age and its relationship to the Antichrist.
Okay. So apologetics in general, then, when you're talking about how to defend the faith, are you just looking for better arguments, or I mean, what basis do we as Christians have for claiming the truth?
Well, I think the foundational verse in the Bible is First Peter 3:15, and it says, for honor Christ in your hearts is holy, but always be ready to give a defense to those who ask about the hope that's within you. And that verse says we should always be ready to give a defense, and we should have good reasons for our faith. And I'd just like to say a couple quick words about what faith means. I mean, the skeptics out there that you'll encounter, they all look at faith as like a blind leap into the dark. Or Mark Twain would say that faith is believing what you know ain't so. Okay? But that is not the way the Bible uses the word faith. And it's really this word's been maligned and redefined in our culture. The way the Bible used the word faith is more akin to what we call trust. Okay, if you look at like the Gospel of John in chapter 20, he says, well, all these things were written so that you would believe. It's an evidential argument that Jesus did all these signs so you will believe. You're not taking a leap into the dark. That we have something solid to ground our trust in. So anytime you see the word faith in the Bible, think about trust. It's an earned trust. It's not just a leap into the dark. So that's my passion, is to provide that evidence and arguments from, philosophical arguments and evidential arguments to show people that it's not a leap in the dark.
So there's something on which the faith is based. There is, because believers in other faiths, other religions, for example, those who, in other faiths and other religions can claim faith as well. But what you're saying is that there is a difference between those faiths which are taken on blind faith, for lack of a better term, and Christianity, which is based on history?
Well, I would, that they probably would say that they have their evidences as well, but I would argue we have much better ones, and that's where the distinction lies.
I would say I would agree with that 100%, and I would say it's really a matter of truth at the end of the day. I mean, if what you're believing isn't true, then you don't need to believe it. I mean, there is ultimately only one truth. I encourage people, no matter how, Satan's deceptions are really crafty, they're really good. He makes it sound very good and uses a little bit of truth, and it's always, but at the end of the day, it's you can dive right into it. You can go find the best possible evidence, not be afraid to find what's out there, and it will always lead you back to the Bible. I think it was Spurgeon that said, that the Bible doesn't need me to defend it. It's like a lion, just let it out of its cage and it will defend itself. The other thing I would say about that in terms of the biblical mandate, I would say that broadly speaking, the Bible itself is apologetics. I mean, a lot of the epistles of Paul specifically were written for specific heresies, the well-known ones, Galatians and Colossians. But really, in the corpus of Paul's stuff, Hebrews, or I don't know who wrote Hebrews, but let's just say it was Paul or whoever, and all throughout the course of it, you see that even Peter's letters talk extensively about false prophets, and they're actually talking about big time heresies, worshiping angels, or Jesus wasn't God, or different things. And 2 Timothy also is in a sense just pleading with Timothy, you've got to deal with this. They're going to keep coming. They're going to get stronger. There's going to have to be something that we're always going to do. And I think that for every deception that Satan brings up, God raises up somebody else to defeat it. It's not like it's always just a constant battle that's always going on. He does something and the counter does it, but it's always about truth at the end of the day.
We'd like to welcome into the conversation now our late arriving guest, but that's all right. We've been making this a pattern here so far the first couple nights at the conference. He's the man behind prophecymatters.com. And would it be right to call you an apologist for the faith?
Absolutely.
Jim Fletcher. Jim, welcome.
Thanks, Derek. It's nice to be with you.
Your workshop this weekend. Tell us a little bit about what folks can expect.
Well, two different topics. The first is the question of whether Zechariah was predicting nuclear war.
Ooh.
And then the second is a discussion of the rise of the emergent community within the church and the dangers therein.
That we could do a whole 2 hours on that, I think. But so we'll have plenty to discuss over the next couple of hours. So we appreciate you making time to stay and play with us here tonight. So let me toss this out for whoever wants to field this one. What is the most difficult obstacle for someone who is trying to defend the faith, to give a ready defense for the hope we have in Christ Jesus? What is the most difficult obstacle most of us face when presented with an opportunity to explain why we buy into this system of belief?
I could start out. I mean, one of the classic problems, and probably, most apologists would probably acknowledge it as one of the hardest, is called the problem of evil. And that this is the argument that, if there's a good God who's sovereign and in charge of all things, why do we see so much evil? Why do we see so much suffering and pain in the world?
Bad things happen to good people.
Yeah, and why are babies dying? There's horrible things that we see, and as an apologist, you can't ignore that. There's a lot of suffering and pain in the world, and a lot of injustice. And one of my first session of my tactics thing that I taught today, we talked about this a little bit. And there's this idea in our culture that morals are relative, okay? And this is called postmodernism. And most of your skeptics and atheists are that way. They think that society makes the rules and that morals are kind of individual decisions that we all come to. Well, what I would argue is that the relativist, the postmodernist, can't complain about the problem of evil. And the reason why is that for evil to exist, there has to be some kind of standard to judge it by. Who gets to decide what's evil? And this is what C.S. Lewis converted to Christianity over, because he had objected to God because of injustice. And if you read Mere Christianity, he talks about, well, what was this idea of justice that I had that I could perceive injustice? Mm-hmm. Okay, if you know that a line is crooked, that means you know what a straight line looks like to compare it to. Okay, so the relativist basically is objecting to the existence of God. It's like them saying, well, I don't believe God exists. Why? Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts? Yeah, I just can't stand the taste of the Brussels sprouts, and I just can't believe that a good God would allow something that I don't like to exist.
Yeah.
Okay? If morals are just your preference, then you don't have a complaint with the problem of evil. So that's one way to really undermine that. And see, the Bible addresses evil, and there is an answer, and we know that it's sin, and it's disobedience to the laws that the way God would like to have it. So God's allowing evil. We believe that's for a temporary time, and I think a lot of us here at the Future Congress are expecting the Lord to intervene momentarily.
We've had a number of folks here in the audience and around the hotel today have expressed the opinion that this might be the first and last, and not because we don't want to have another one, but we may not have enough time for another one. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other objections then. You've touched on the big one. Why do bad things happen to good people if there's a good God? What about another one that has really come to light recently with the publication of Rob Bell's book, that a good and loving God would not dare condemn or wouldn't condemn people to eternal torment? How, in defending the faith, how do we address that?
Well, I think that Scripture is clear on the question of the existence of hell. The thing that dovetails, I think, here with some of the research I've become interested in is the fact that, a guy like Bell, his ideas aren't new. They were being bandied about in the 19th century in Europe, and then they were exported to the U.S., and really they have roots in Darwinian philosophy. It's the rise of the evolutionizing of our culture that has caused people to disbelieve Scripture. It's been relegated to myth or legend. It's metaphorical. It's symbolic. It's anything except what it says.
And when people buy into that, they move further and further away from Scripture as a guide for life. And so I also see a real link between evolutionary worldview and the denial of last days teaching. If you don't believe in the early accounts of Genesis as history, then you're likely not going to believe in the books of the prophets. And so to come back around to Bell, he is simply working out a worldview that he's embraced, but was really developed a couple of hundred years ago, and is popularized in our culture today, especially in the evangelical world. That's the critical thing right now is the inroads that guys like this have made into the evangelical church. And so you take obvious scriptural realities, they aren't obvious to people in our culture today because they see Scripture completely different than we did a few generations ago.
I would add to that, and I would say that is ultimately the biggest issue with, and when you're trying to deal with, interfaith kind of issues like that, is hermeneutics. I mean, if you ultimately can't explain something to somebody if they don't believe that the Bible says what it means and means what it says, and in something like the hell thing, usually that's coming from somebody that's ostensibly saying that they believe in the same type of hermeneutics, but the method in which people are deceived by it is one where they appeal to their sort of intellect and their sense of elitism. They'll throw out Gehenna, and most people don't know that the Hades and Gehenna thing. So the first person that tells them, oh, didn't you hear? There's a Greek word named Gehenna, and they take you down this road, and before long you're like, oh, I know something that nobody else knows, and it's the same old thing, in Garden of Eden all over again. And really, the hell thing has just gone crazy lately. Got more stuff on that lately than ever before. Maybe it's because of him, but I think that ultimately the health thing relates to the first question you asked, which was, I think, the primary problem and the biggest challenge is the will of people are trying to find something to throw away God with, in their hearts, and it doesn't really matter if hell is just one thing that they use, and so you can explain something to people all day, and that they're engaging you, and the reason they're even talking with apologists in the first place is because they're trying to throw off this, thing that they perceive as, a burden, and so they're just trying to make excuses for it. So those are the ones that are just like, eventually you're like, a man who's a heretic after first and second admonition reject, but I don't know.
Well, hell is a distasteful notion. And he's absolutely right that the Scripture is crystal clear on it. It's distasteful to people, and it's scary, and it seems really harsh, and it's hard to come up with a trite answer to why we have an eternal punishment. Okay, but that doesn't diminish the fact that the Bible clearly teaches it, and even more so. What I find very interesting is that you don't see it much in the Old Testament at all. Okay, the ancient Hebrews didn't really have this concept. They said Sheol, which was death, and they just kind of believed you died. And they had various views in the intertestamental period about Hades and things like that. But all the teaching that we have on hell comes straight from Jesus. Okay, now that is very meaningful, because if you think about even people that are skeptical, or the humanists, and people like Rob Bell, they all acknowledge Jesus has this transcendent, beautiful teaching about love and caring for your neighbors, and they all love that stuff. Mm-hmm. But what they're ignoring is this same guy is the one that everything we get about eternal punishment and hell and flames and worms that don't die and all these things come right from him. Yeah. Okay? Now, to me, Jesus' teaching in a lot of ways authenticates itself, because it's just not the sort of thing that men come up with. The kind of things that he said are self-authenticating, and a lot of why I believe the New Testament is because it just is not made up. I can tell that it comes from a divine source just because of the way Jesus taught. Now, I think that God had the message about hell come from his lips because it wouldn't be believable from anyone else.
It's an interesting point. That's Chris Putnam. We've also got Chris White with us and Jim Fletcher. I'm Derek Gilbert. We're on A View from the Bunker, live from Branson, Missouri, for the Future Congress on Emerging Threats and Challenges 2011, as we discuss prophecy and apologetics. Now, you talk about your sense of knowing that the New Testament is true, just by the way it's written. A friend of mine calls it the seamer. It seems right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your seamer is refined through life. The older you get, the more accurate your seamer is. There are some folks you meet, and something just seems not quite right. But that's probably not going to win over a skeptic. So how can we then defend the accuracy of the New Testament? How do we know that the words between the covers of the Bible, especially the New Testament, which tells us everything about Jesus Christ, are accurate and preserved accurately?
Well, there's a whole science and art of textual criticism, okay? And we have very good scholars, and we have hundreds of years, if not thousands, but in the last 100 years, they've discovered over 5,000 New Testament Greek manuscripts, okay? And that's quite a few, like since, 200 years ago, they only had maybe 30. I mean, so archaeology has done a lot of work, okay? And the scholars really decipher these, and they break down all the variants. And most of the differences that they find in manuscripts are things like spelling, the order of words. Almost no major doctrines are ever affected. And with all this work and all this criticism that has gone into this by scholars, they have it down to 99.6%, and that's a conservative percentage.
In other words, the Bible that we hold, the New Testament that we have, is 99.6%, the same as when it was written.
In
the first century.
And they do that by comparing. If you have 5,000 manuscripts, you look at all 5,000 of them, and you see where the little differences are, and you see where the main line goes, and the differences are really small. But things like spelling, and they can get back to the original text by looking at the majority text. So we have really, really good evidence that the New Testament we have has not been changed or altered. And the fact that we can see manuscripts where it was changed and verify what the original text was, so we can trust that we have the original words.
I would say one of my strongest, I think there's historical arguments too. You have historians looking at that time and seeing, Luke as being this consummate historian, wrote obviously the book of Luke and Acts. Sir William Ramsay came to the faith because of this. He was an archaeologist. I could read some great quotes from him, but I think one of the best ones, is he's describing his conversion on the basis of, he was trying to disprove that the book of Acts was written. I think he thought it was written in the 2nd century. Finally, his conclusion is Luke is a historian of first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. But I think that the best evidence is the skeptics of the day. They really provide what I think is the strongest evidence of the what in terms of what the Bible claims happened, and that it's a faithful telling of what the apostles saw and did. All those facts are corroborated. You can see that in so many different ways. But the people that hated Christianity I think are the best voices, because they're trying to do anything that they can to, they're losing converts in the synagogues. The temples are losing converts even in the New Testament times. So it's their voices that I think are really corroborating, and you have a historical record. There's more of that kind of stuff than you have for just about anything. And they're all, and if they thought that, for instance, Jesus didn't exist, that didn't come till the 18th century. You would expect to hear that from Jesus' enemies. Hey, I'm losing converts. Hey, what are you guys doing? This guy didn't even exist, But instead they're like, his miracles were parlor tricks, and trying to come up with different
His
things.
disciples stole the body, right?
Chris brings up a really great point. I think, again, a lot of this comes down to philosophical bias. I'm reminded of a quote I read once from John Morris of the Institute for Creation Research, and he said, we have thousands of manuscripts in the New Testament, and it's disputed. We have 2 ancient accounts of Hannibal crossing the Alps, and nobody questions whether it happened or not. Nobody questions whether the Caesars existed. Mm-hmm. It's the New Testament that's attacked. So what is the agenda there? What is the motive behind the attack? It's an anti-God bias.
Well, truth is, Chris mentioned the concept of truth. and I talked about postmodernism a little bit. But I mean, you know, our definition of truth should be that which corresponds to reality. Okay. Now, when I look at the worldview that the typical agnostic or skeptic has, they believe that people are basically good, and you know that we're victims of circumstances and all that. Now, the Bible has a radically different message. It says people are basically sinful and depraved, and you know no one deserves to go to heaven. Okay, and people don't like to hear that. Okay, that's something that people are going to fight instinctively. People want to believe that they're good people and they're victims of circumstances, right? The Bible doesn't pander to that worldview at all. But, you know, when I look around at reality and which worldview matches reality, I mean, let's look at the 20th century. I mean, we've had the Holocaust. We've had Stalin. You know, between Stalin and Mao, over 100 million people got murdered. Now, are people basically good, or are they basically depraved and in need of a savior? Now, to me, that's just a stark reality. That the story that the Bible gives, the worldview from the Bible, matches reality much better than what I'm hearing from Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens.
Jim, you mentioned earlier a belief in the Genesis account of the creation of the world. We've been talking more or less about the New Testament to this point. Let's look at the Old Testament a little bit. A lot of folks sitting in the pews on Sunday morning don't necessarily accept anything before Abraham, and maybe not even Abraham, as historic. Why is it important to accept the historic accounts of the first 5-6 chapters of Genesis? I would argue in this setting, probably the first 6 chapters, if you know what I'm talking about, as authentic and historic.
Well, several reasons. The first one that comes to mind is the gospel itself. The gospel is, as Ken Hammonds said, is predicated on Adam and Eve being real people. If there was no fall, then why do we need Jesus? Why you know, the suffering and the atonement? So it starts with that. But I think also that you simply miss real history if you don't accept the early Genesis accounts. I know it's controversial, but for myself, I mean, I have a journalism degree, and when I read the early chapters of Genesis, they are not poetic as a Rob Bell or John Spahn would allege. They're a very straightforward account of what happened. It's a simple fact. And so because of that, if you read it that way, you then understand where the people groups came from. Genesis chapter 10, the Table of Nations. You then understand where the Jewish people came from. The Jewish people were born in the book of Genesis. And so reality makes sense that way. I often say that what we see in the Bible is what we see in reality. If you accept an evolutionary understanding of that, especially the Darwinian view, then your whole discernment about history, even present history, is completely skewed. An example right now is the fact that our diplomats and political leaders do not see the Old Testament promises of the Jews as still being valid, and so a land for peace deal with the Palestinians makes sense to them. From a human perspective, it makes sense. Of course, from a biblical perspective, it's wrong. But at the very beginning, if you miss that, then you'll miss the rest of everything else. And the last thing I'd say on that is that one of the things we have to look at is how our young people are being affected today. And I know from talking to people all the time about this issue, young people are quite intelligent, and they're able to understand the issues. And a lot of times young people will say to me, look, if you're going to tell me that the patriarchs in Genesis didn't really exist, all the way down to David and these major figures, why are you telling me Jesus was here? What, did he die on the cross? Did he even exist? That's where young people are today. And that kind of thinking, which has virtually destroyed Western civilization, comes from a misunderstanding of the Book of Genesis.
It destroyed Western civilization. How?
Well, it's brought in a whole range of things. I mean, the barbarians of the 20th century that started world wars were all steeped in evolution. They all read it. They embraced it. In the 19th century, it wasn't only Charles Darwin who introduced these ideas. Darwin was concerned with biological evolution. Herbert Spencer, his contemporary and colleague in a way, really took it into other fields. Spencer was the guy who made evolution palatable for every other field of science, including astronomy, and so it reached into every area. And so now, for example, you have a situation where if a person is pro-abortion, they simply don't have a value for human life that a person who is a Bible believer would. So I think that's one of the cultural problems that we have today.
That's Jim Fletcher, prophecymatters.com. We've also got Chris Putnam, logosapologia.org. Mm-hmm. And Chris White, which website should I point them to?
Nowheretorunradio.com.
Nowheretorunradio.com. I'm Derek Gilbert. This is A View from the Bunker, live from the Future Congress on Emerging Threats and Challenges in Branson, Missouri. We see quite a few people in the chat room at blogtalkradio.com/PID radio. If you've got a question, you feel free to post it up there. We will not be taking phone calls tonight just because of the technical limits that we're working under here. I'm just thankful we've got enough of an internet connection to get this out to the web. And so far, they say a couple of jitters and skips, but overall, folks listening are hearing us just fine. The Jesus myth. Oh, just one caution, by the way, when you jiggle around those microphones, they are creating a little bit of noise. So,
okay.
Chris White, you had mentioned the Jesus myth earlier. Are there seriously skeptics out there who persist in claiming that Jesus Christ was a fiction?
It really is. Zeitgeist, as I mentioned, was one that popularized it. 100 million people have seen that video, The God Who Wasn't There. It's huge, and it's growing all the time from sources all over the place. The people that are behind it, it's not like a thing that people are behind it, but a lot of the main people that people point to, again, they offer it in a really intellectual way. They have what appears to be a very intellectual argument. They're appealing to somebody's, look, this is the real deal. This is the intellectual way to go. And that's really the lure of things like Zeitgeist and The God Who Wasn't There and Acharya S and all these people who are doing this. And it's really gotten really good. It's still really terrible arguments, but it's gotten very intellectual sounding.
Well, when you say good, you mean just professional or slick? Not
there you go.
Not good in terms of making sense.
I think one of my favorite ways to point that out, a guy named Greg Braden. His publishing company is called Sounds True Publishing. I think it's very appropriate to what's going on with that. But that theory, I just did some research in the history of it, and it was so notable that it didn't show up till the 18th century, and it had a few adherents here and there. It briefly got picked up by Lenin, and he put it in the textbooks and things like that. To this day, when people ask for scholarly sources on it, they often bring up the Russian textbooks and say, look, here's some scholars that we're all aboard. Bruno Bauer is another one they bring it from the 1800s. It's very, very it's not supported by scholarly sources, but they sure do make it look like it is.
It's pretty much Archaea S, right? Is the main one. This is like a militant female atheist, I believe, that uses a few different pseudonyms, and she's got a couple books out. I mean, 3 or 4, I think.
She's leading the charge. The arguments against it are really complete and very, very bulletproof. The main thing that they all have to do is deal with the evidence that there is to the contrary, and that is where they all fail. Mm-hmm. They have to deal with Tacitus. They have to deal with Suetonius, and we could go on and on. Josephus is one that is often said, is a forgery, But when you look at what is actually contested about that passage, the only real thing is, did Josephus think it was the Messiah or not? Right. The fact that he wrote about him is not in question.
Now, when you're talking about Tacitus and Suetonius and Josephus, explain a little bit more for people who may not be familiar with. We're talking about extra biblical sources that attest to the life of Jesus.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting to see the way Zeitgeist even worded it when they put that out. They said only 4 historians, and they know good and well there are some. There's I think some 40 sources that mention Jesus within 150 years of his lifetime. But they say only 4 historians because it's like how many historians do you really need to agree that somebody existed? Is it 5? And you take Tiberius Caesar. This is a good example that I like to point out. Tiberius Caesar was the most famous person in Jesus' day, right? Bar none.
Leader of the free world, basically. Then
this is an interesting thing to put it all in perspective. He reigned during Jesus' ministry, so he was the most famous person in Jesus' lifetime. Has only 10 authors who mention his existence within 150 years of his life. These include Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Seneca, Paterculus, Plutarch, Pliny the Elder, Strabo, and another one. And Luke, the Bible writer. If you remove Luke, since he's a New Testament source, there's only 9 secular non-Christian sources. This means there are as many non-Christian sources for Jesus' existence as there are for Tiberius Caesar's. Huh. And to compare the total number of sources between Jesus and Tiberius Caesar, it's 42 to 10. Therefore, there are only over 4 times as many sources for Jesus' life and deeds than for Tiberius Caesar's. And the point I was making earlier is that those are his enemies that would have salivated at the opportunity to say, this guy didn't even exist, But nobody makes that argument until the 1800s. And when in the Enlightenment period.
And you have to think about how insane the argument really is and how absurd it truly is. Because if you think about, nobody denies Tiberius Caesar, like he said. But, I mean, how many people remember anything that he did? Hardly anybody, right? But what kind of impact did Jesus of Nazareth have on Western culture?
Basically,
the world.
Divided time.
Absolutely.
Before and after.
Yeah. I mean, we have AD and BC.
Yeah.
I mean, time is kept by his birth and death.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and so how absurd is it for someone to say that he didn't exist and demand, secular sources to confirm it? One thing that I always do when people start, screaming for non-biblical sources is say, back up a minute. I mean, the sources in the Bible are very good, okay? And for one thing, they try to dismiss the Bible offhand as one source. Wait a minute. It's 66 books by 40 different authors, right? Yes, 27 different New Testament manuscripts. Mm-hmm. They didn't all get compiled for a couple hundred years. So these are all separate sources by different authors, mm-hmm. and they corroborate each other. So it's not just one source. You can't just throw the Bible out and go wave your hand. Mm-hmm. You have to look at, the earliest evidence we have is from the Apostle Paul. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, there's a creed, like verses 3 through 7, mm-hmm. And he talks about the resurrection and over 500 witnesses.
Yeah,
okay, we can date that creed all the way back to about the time that it happened when Jesus was crucified. And the way they can do that is we know when 1 Corinthians was written because Paul mentions being tried by a Roman proconsul whose name was Gallio. Okay, and we have Roman secular records that tell us when Gallio was in this certain area where Paul was when he was tried. And they know that he was only there for 2 years. So Paul got tried by Gallio, and so we can date that to like 65 A.D. Okay, that means 1 Corinthians had to be written within a couple of years of that. And so even skeptical scholars acknowledge this. Mm-hmm. So that's only 30 years after Jesus' crucifixion. And Paul's talking about this creed, and he's saying these witnesses are still alive. You can go ask them.
Yeah, that's the thing about 1 Corinthians 15 that just blew me away when I was trying to figure out what it was I believed. And I read that, and I've got to give props to Lee Strobel, The Case for Christ, mm-hmm. which helped me figure out that God was not this amorphous, cosmic watchmaker who sort of set things in motion and just let it roll. That's what Paul was saying to the church. If you don't believe, go to Jerusalem. The witnesses are still there. Well, given all of this, Jim, with the eyewitness testimony of guys like Peter and John who said, we saw this, and this is what we're testifying to you, and Paul who said, this is what Peter and James and John told me, and there are still witnesses who saw him walking around Jerusalem this very day. Why then are we seeing people inside our own congregations, the emergent movement, who are not taking the words of Jesus Christ as authoritative?
Well, and that's the really disturbing aspect, I think, about this whole thing as where we are right now. The skeptics outside the church are one thing, but the skeptics within the church are another. And I find it very disturbing that you have these radical scholars, they call themselves, who say that it's okay to disbelieve in the Bible. By the way, there's a direct paper trail between someone who we would consider on the fringes like a Marcus Borg or a John Spong and the emergent guys. They really believe in essence the same things, but to your question, I think that again it goes back to the fact that the human condition is to rebel against the Creator. And if you don't have evidence to refute His existence, then you're going to go find something. And so again, it comes down to philosophical bias. I mean, if you go back and you look at the beginnings of some of this kind of thought, the Enlightenment thinkers, which one of the guests mentioned, really we have Enlightenment thinkers in the church today, but they simply wanted to get rid of the notion of the God of the Bible, and so they shaped reality to that, and that's what's really going on today. Sadly enough, they seem to be people of authority, and younger people maybe don't have the life experience to understand where this bias comes from, or bias being presented to them. And then you have even adults in the church, though, that are sort of silenced by these arguments because they sound very authoritative, but as Chris have pointed out, there's really nothing behind the curtain.
We definitely at this conference need to touch on the subject of prophecy, and I know that to borrow a phrase from the 1950s charlatan, The Amazing Criswell, we're all interested in the future because that's where we'll spend the rest of our lives. The prophecy contained in the Bible, how does that help us to determine the truth, the authenticity of the Bible?
Well, I think, we just heard Chuck Missler talk here at the Future Congress. And, Chuck was one of the people that, I became a Christian in my 30s. I was a skeptic. And that's why I'm an apologist today, because, I went looking for the evidence. And Chuck was one of the people that helped lead me to Christ. And he presents a really strong case from prophecy that God exists outside of our time domain because He writes the future in advance, and that's the way He authenticates His word. And for that reason, the argument from prophecy as an apologist is one that I really work hard at, and it's one that I kind of have aspirations to maybe write a book about. Sometimes I think it's presented in an ineffective way, and I could tell you real briefly why I think so, and what I would like to see done differently. The problem is I've debated a lot of atheists and skeptics, and I've used the argument from prophecy. We have these 300 messianic prophecies in the Old Testament, and they match Jesus. And so that just proves that, and if you're a believer, it's very convincing. And I absolutely believe it, and I'm not trying to deny it. But if you look at it from the skeptic's point of view, what they're going to come back with was, wait a minute. They're saying that they think that the guys in the New Testament saw the prophecies and then created Jesus and based Him on the Old Testament. So the argument doesn't really convince them because they think that Jesus is made up based on the Old Testament. So when you say He fulfilled them, they go, well, so what? They just read the Old Testament and wrote His life out to fit it. So, it doesn't work so well with them. So what I think we need to do to use it as an apologetic is you really need to demonstrate that the prophecy was written before it happened, and then to the best of your ability, you have to authenticate it how it happened after, and if possible, have extra biblical sources. And there's some prophecies that work really well for that.
Well, let's get into that. What prophecies can we use to help authenticate the authenticity of the Bible?
One of the favorites that I've noticed that is the one about Tyre and Ezekiel, and it has fulfillments that even go into the way after the New Testament period. It was prophesied that the city of Tyre would be sacked. It says in the Old Testament, it says it would be scraped. And that happened when Alexander the Great came through and absolutely scraped the city to the ground and built a land bridge out to an island to attack the rest of it. So there's really details. And the thing is, it did not happen all at once. It happened over a period of hundreds of years, even into the modern period, because part of that prophecy says that they'll stretch out fishing nets there. And we see that happening there today. And so it's
fishermen drying out their nets where Tyre used to stand.
Where Tyre used to stand. And I noticed on your website, I took a look at it today when I saw your link. You have the formation of the modern nation of Israel. Now, some people in the church don't want to acknowledge that that's a modern fulfillment of prophecy, but I absolutely believe it is. If you look at the Old Testament, you can't deny that God has a future for Israel. Now, I don't necessarily agree with all the politics that goes on in Israel today. I don't necessarily support everything that they do. But as far as them being a nation and having the right to exist, I absolutely do. And do I believe that, the things that are in Ezekiel about the dry bones coming back alive, I think that was, to me, that sounds like what happened after the Holocaust. And I see that, you literally saw the skeletons. The dry bones were literally there, and then the nation reforms, and it just, that to me just screams a modern fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. You could probably say a lot more about that.
Well, how important is Israel to our understanding of prophecy and its authentication of Scripture?
Well, I mean, I would present my own bias by saying that overwhelmingly the signal that the Bible is self-authenticating and that we're in the last days is the reemergence of the Jews as a sovereign nation. If you look at the totality of the Old Testament and the promise after promise after promise where the Lord said He would return them in the last days after a long period of exile, and they're there today, that is a devastating, devastating reply to the skeptics, and one that I've never heard adequately answered. I'll tell you a quick personal story that illustrates this for me. Last month, I took my 19-year-old son to Israel for the first time, and just the two of us. And the trip was exactly what I hoped it would be. And I had, of course, talked to him a bit before that, and I said, look, you have to understand that we live at the time in history when the Jews have re-entered history. It's incredible. And so one night we were staying at Christ Church guest house just inside the old city in Jaffa Gate. And so as usual, Dad was long asleep, and Jonathan was awake, and he told me this the next day. He said, Dad, I couldn't sleep, and I got up and I walked outside the compound there at Christ Church, and I turned to the left to the alleyway that leads to the Jewish Quarter. And he said there was some event that night in the Jewish Quarter, and all of a sudden at 1 o'clock in the morning, I saw 200 Jews walking out to go to their cars or however they got home. And he said, I really get it now. He said, I understand. They're there, and historically, humanly speaking, they should not be there. Benjamin Netanyahu is prime minister, but he's also a historian himself. His father's a great historian. Netanyahu said if it weren't for the pogroms and all the other harassment of Jews over the years, there should be over 200 million Jews in the world. And today there's less than 15 million. But they're here. No other ancient people has been exiled for so long and came back. It's unprecedented in human history. And when you can see it, it's overwhelming evidence that the Bible is true and that the God of the Bible is very real and very active in our world today.
What about the prophecies of Jesus Christ? Chris White, you mentioned the 300 messianic prophecies. How do we know that those weren't written into the Bible after the fact?
Well, I think that in terms of Jesus, to me, the most impactful in terms of evangelism and other things are those of the suffering servant, because those aren't ones that are readily. I don't really know what the current Jewish thought on stuff like that is as far as Isaiah 53. But when you read Isaiah 53, surely he has borne our griefs and carried out our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions; he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. Like sheep, we have gone astray. I mean, we're talking gospel here, like the heart of the gospel. And to me, when the only question that comes up at that point is, did the crucifixion happen? What facts can you validate about that event? Because then you start to become on a fact-finding mission. Because if this says this and that happened, then we've got a whole gospel thing we've got to figure out, and it's really start at the heart of that. So I would say that would be one of the favorite angles there for that. And I've seen a lot of effect in that in evangelism. But to me, I don't know if this. I think the people recognize something's going on in the world, and they know that they can see the events coming to a head, and that's an argument in itself. That, like you were saying, the Bible describes the heart of man better than anything else in the current sort of view of the world. But I also think it's describing the world, and their argument against that is, well, that the Illuminati wrote the Bible, and that's what they're all playing out this whole plan. But I love that argument, because what they're all missing is that the Bible's doing something much more than just saying Armageddon's coming. It's saying Armageddon's coming, but before that, there's going to be a false peace. It's a warning of something that nobody else does. It's a warning of deception. I think one of the strongest focuses of prophecy from the Lord on the Mount of Olives, and certainly I think even really the 2 Thessalonians and the Book of Revelation is a warning of coming deception. And in a context of a peace that is a false peace and a deception that's so great that people are going to give up their kids and family members to be killed and think that they're doing a good thing. That's the kind of deception that's coming. And because it's so huge, so big, so whatever, that we required this. So I think that's always missed in the context of it. And, so yeah.
Well, I definitely want to get into more of what is coming in the second hour here, because we've got yet a lot of ground to cover and a lot of time yet. But there was a question I think that is important to address. And again, it gets back to the one I asked previously. How do we know these prophecies, like Isaiah 53, weren't written into the Scriptures after the fact to validate Jesus Christ as Messiah?
Okay, Isaiah 53 is one of the best examples of a messianic prophecy, and Chris just read it. I mean, he was bruised for our transgressions.
Yeah.
Okay, it really has the life of Jesus and the gospel in it, and if you read it carefully, it's chilling. Okay, it's one of the ones that really convinced me. Now,
Dead Sea Scrolls too.
Yeah, absolutely. And when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls in this cave, okay, they found a complete scroll of Isaiah. Okay, complete scroll, and the Isaiah 53 is there letter for letter, the way that we have it in our modern Bibles, okay? There's like one word that's spelled differently. It's the word light, and I've verified this myself in the Hebrew. I mean, it's there letter for letter. It's in the museum in Jerusalem. You can go see it. Now, even liberal scholars date that scroll at 100 BC, okay? At least 100 years before Jesus was born, right around. And so we can date that solidly, undeniably, before he was born. And it describes what you read in the Gospels to a T.
And well, what about the Septuagint? How does that, when was that translated, and how does that affect the authenticity of those prophecies?
It's just another verification. I mean, it's dated around 300 for the translation, and it's there too. They translated it into Greek, and so, I mean, there's some debate with the Septuagint. was it just the Torah that got done in 300, and then maybe the rest of it was finished in the second century? But it still doesn't matter. It's still a couple hundred years before Jesus was born, minimum. So I mean, there's multiple copies. There's just no doubt that was written long before he was born.
So the prophecy of Daniel predicting the coming of Messiah almost to the day. The prophecy of in the Psalms. Of crucifixion in
Psalm
a time,
22.
Psalm 22, at the very latest. I mean, even if you argue that couldn't have been written by David, it couldn't have been written by Isaiah, it was some other guy, whoever wrote it, it was still at least 200 years prior to the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. That convinces me. We're talking with Chris White, nowheretorunradio.com, Chris Putnam, logosapollo.org, Jim Fletcher, prophecymatters.com, and A View from the Bunker, live from the Future Congress on Emerging Threats and Challenges in Branson, Missouri. We're going to take a little break now, a couple of minutes, just to catch our breath, refill our coffee mugs or soda cans, whichever the case may be, give folks here in the room, and very kind of you to sit very patiently with us here over the course of this first hour, an opportunity to stretch your legs as we prepare for the second hour. What is coming ahead? What do we read in prophecy about what is coming down the pike? Specifically, the topic of Jim's talk, we'll make sure we get to that. Did Zechariah predict and prophesy nuclear war? All that's ahead as A View from the Bunker continues live from Branson, Missouri on the PID Radio Network.
Homeland Security is now advising all U.S. citizens to be prepared for an emergency. At SurvivorMall.com, you'll find the best deals on emergency supplies, including Mountain House 30-year shelf-life freeze-dried foods for your emergency pantry, storm shelter, or even bomb shelter. And at SurvivorMall.com, we have 3-month, 6-month, and 1-year emergency food kits priced so low you won't find a better deal anywhere. Plus, your friends at SurvivorMall.com do something nobody anywhere else does. Give you a free survival kit with every emergency food supply system. Why spend hundreds of dollars for a survival kit when you can get it free? Mountain House Foods is the #1 long-term storage food brand. It's been the choice of backpackers, hikers, campers, survivalists, outdoor enthusiasts, and people just like you for over 30 years. With SurvivorMall.com's wide selection of single or double-serve entrees and a huge variety of up to 30-year number 10 storage cans, they're sure to have the meals you or your family will need, and when you need it most. When it comes to long-term storage foods, emergency preparedness, and recreational activities like camping, hiking, backpacking, and hunting, Mountain House has been recognized as the best-tasting freeze-dried meals anywhere. Mountain House is convenient, easy to prepare, and has the longest shelf life of all. So invest in some peace of mind and check out the great deals on Mountain House Foods at www.survivormall.com. That's www.survivormall.com. Survivor Mall, the #1 online retailer where government agencies, state, fire departments, public schools, universities, civic organizations, care homes, soldiers, police and security officers, citizens like you, and even Hollywood stars get their emergency preparedness supplies. Survivor Mall. Don't live in fear. Get the gear.
In the 14th century, the Black Death killed nearly 1/3 the population of Europe. In 1918, the Spanish flu killed as many as 100 million people. The next great plague may already be spreading. Inspired by today's headlines, it's the Armageddon strain, the explosive thriller from Sharon K. Gilbert. At a laboratory somewhere in the desert southwest, a secretive group has created a deadly virus for a single purpose: to eliminate 90% of human life. Standing in her way is Dr. Maggie Taylor, a woman broken by grief and alcohol, who must somehow find the strength to unravel the mystery of her father's death in time to stop the virus from being released. Infuse magazine says Sharon Gilbert has a talent for making you feel good, scared, on the edge of your seat, and dying for more. And Christian Fiction Review says Sharon Gilbert does a very nice job of suspense and horror step by step. The Armageddon Strain from Sharon K. Gilbert, the newest release in the MythArk, the ultimate battle for mankind. Available now online and at bookstores everywhere.
Doing our best to talk the walk. Live from Branson, Missouri, the Future Congress on Emerging Threats and Challenges. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Tomorrow night, we're going to do this again, live, Lord willing. We're going to talk about the supernatural And guests as of now include Russ Dizdar of Shadow the Darkness, Rob Skiba, the television and film producer working on the forthcoming TV series Seed, and Jeff Patty, who will do some enlighten us on some supernatural topics such as vampires, werewolves, things like that. We'll talk about all of that, demons, fallen angels, how they interact with us in our world, and how we as Christians respond to that interaction. That is tomorrow night, blogtalkradio.com/PID radio. We will kick it off again at 10 p.m. Central Time. That's GMT -5. And we will also, of course, have these shows available in the archives at vftb.net. That's vftb.net. Welcoming back to our panel now, Chris White of Nowhere to Run Radio, nowheretorunradio.com, Chris Putnam of Logos Apologia, which you find online at logosapologia.org, and Jim Fletcher of Prophecy Matters. That's at prophecymatters.com. Well, let's get into the matter of prophecy. The Bible as filled with words telling us of what is to come, prophesied the coming of Jesus Christ and his ultimate end and the reasons for it. But we know the Bible has a lot to say about the end times, which many of us here this weekend believe we're pretty close to, if not in already. Let's go around the table. Let's start with Chris White. Chris, where do you see us on the prophetic timeline, and what do you see coming down the pike?
I see that I would if I was a betting man, I'd put us within a decade of the Lord's return, but I wouldn't be surprised if it went longer than that. I could see that it could take more time to develop and things like that. I would be shocked, I think, if it took much longer than that. Prophetically, as far as where we are in the whole scheme of things, I don't think any of the seals have been opened yet. I honestly think that we are right in that place before any of those seals are broken.
Chris?
Well, the predictions of dates and times has a 100% failure rate in history. So, I try to steer away from that, but I'm like Chris. I mean, I feel as if it could be any time. And I look around at, what I see going on in the world, and it seems to match up with many will fall away and lawlessness will increase. And, one of the most powerful and compelling reasons is what we talked about with Israel. The dispensational way of interpreting prophecy and looking at it would put us, within, that date in 1947, that they became a nation that the time clock started on the end times, like the short time. And I think there's a lot of merit to that argument. I think it has a lot of force. And, you look at what's going on in Israel. Now, Derek, I know you read Dr. Heiser's book, Israel and Armageddon.
Yeah.
And to me, he makes them really powerful.
Islam and Armageddon.
Islam and Armageddon. And that came out, in about 2001, 2002?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I've been studying that recently. I took Old Testament with him last semester, and I really read through that book carefully and wrote him a lot of emails. And, I mean, I see, look at what's going on in Israel. There's this thing with Iran. It looks like a war's going to break out there at any time.
And maybe Syria rather than Iran, actually.
And, a lot of the things that Dr. Heiser talked about in that book was that the Antichrist, the prototype was Antiochus Epiphanes out of Syria. Now, that has some interesting implications. If we're going to see the same, if he's the model, we could see, I don't know. I'm not saying it's going to be a Syrian Antichrist, but I find that very interesting that I see Syria heating up with Antiochus as the model. So I think you watch Israel for your prophetic timeline and see what's going on there. And it looks like there's going to be a war there soon.
Okay. Jim, your thoughts?
Well, I totally agree that Israel is the signpost. You have a situation where at one time the problem for the world really was just the Jewish state itself. And then you had this intensifying pressure brought on by the Oslo negotiations over the status of Jerusalem. And now you have an intensifying look at the Temple Mount. And so they literally are like birth pangs of these things intensifying. There's something though that I may differ with some. It's interesting to me that everybody is worried about Israel's security, and they're worried about the Iranian threat, and those are valid concerns. The Iranians are we view them as irrational. Ahmadinejad has been very clear about what he wants to do. But Ahmadinejad has said the same things that Nasser of Egypt said, the same thing that Hitler said. They were always going to get rid of the Jews. And so one of the interesting things in last days prophecy that I think is fascinating is the fact that scripturally it is not Israel that's in trouble. It's everybody else. Ultimately, I don't worry about Israel's security. If Scripture can be believed, and if God can keep His word, He's already said that He's going to preserve them. In the book of Amos, He says, "When I bring you back for the last time, you'll never be uprooted again." So I don't worry about the Jews being expelled from the land again and things like that. But the fact remains that Scripture is also clear that there will be this intensifying pressure on the Jews at the time of the end. I believe that a trigger for this is going to be the status of Jerusalem. I think that the international community is very close. In fact, the President virtually said this several weeks ago, that the international community is getting tired of the peace process. What he meant was the international community is getting tired of the Jews. They're getting tired of Israel's alleged intransigence. And so, for example, a few weeks ago I drove through the famous Israeli suburb of Ma'ale Adumim, and it's a beautiful suburb, beautiful buildings, people walking around, businesses, homes. You can't physically remove that place and establish a Palestinian state. So how are they going to do it? It's an unsolvable problem, and so it's going to trigger, I think, the Zechariah War.
Well, let's talk about that, since that's one of the topics that you'll be discussing here this weekend, the Zechariah War. What is it, and what does Zechariah have to say about it?
Well, he records the Lord's thoughts of what He has planned for the nations who come against Israel. And this is talked about in other places in Scripture, but in this one instance, especially the last several chapters of the book of Zechariah, the Lord says what He is going to do to those nations for the way they have treated the Jews. And He said, I'm going to enter into judgment against them. I'm going to meet them in the valley of Jehoshaphat, which is in Jerusalem. I'm going to enter into judgment with them there. And it describes a confrontation, and I'll go ahead and give away the answer to my talk tomorrow, so probably no one will need to show up. It's very obvious that Zechariah is recording a future war unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. The description, especially in chapter 14, people dying on their feet and their eyes and tongues melting out of their heads, can't be another description other than a nuclear confrontation. And if you understand, which we'll get into tomorrow, some of the nuclear capabilities of the people in the region, I think that particular scenario is very, very plausible at this time.
When in the prophetic timeline will this take place? Psalm 83, Ezekiel 38, where would this, is this in conjunction with one of those prophesied conflicts, or is this something separate?
It seems to me to be a separate conflict, and one of the things that I don't delve into a lot, and is probably just simply a weakness in teaching, but timing and chronology of the very last days events and confrontations I don't normally get into. Whether one precedes another, I don't exactly know. What I do believe is that they clearly are descriptive of events that are in the very last days. And so, having said that, though, the Zechariah war is obviously a huge war. I mean, any time that you're discussing a nuclear confrontation goes beyond the bounds of conventional war. It is interesting to me that in the Gog-Magog passage of Ezekiel 38:39, there also appears to be a description of sorts of cleanup after a nuclear strike, and so it could be that they're linked.
I actually I wrote a paper for Dr. Heiser on the Old Testament background to Armageddon, and it's a lot from the book Islam and Armageddon, some of those ideas. My view on what you're talking about, I think Zechariah 14 is probably the Battle of Armageddon, because it talks about, this is when, it sounds like to me this is when Jesus comes back to the Mount of Olives, and it says it splits in two. I don't see that happening more than once. So if that's when he arrives, that's the end of the Battle of Armageddon. That's what I would use the Mount of Olives reference as the point of reference to match those two. And my view of Ezekiel 38:39 is it's kind of interesting. It's kind of what Heiser talks about in Islam and Armageddon, in that if you read Revelation, it talks about Gog-Magog after the millennium. If you read
right,
so that's a specific reference. So I have to see that 38:39 has to refer to that, because it uses Gog-Magog right there. But there's also, prophecy is more of a pattern. Now, Chuck Missler teaches this, and I'm a member of the Koinonia Institute as well, and it's absolutely true that you don't just see strict linear prediction fulfillment. You see almost a pattern, okay? And I think Ezekiel 38:39 describes more than one battle. And I think it describes Armageddon, and you can match it to Armageddon, because if you look in Revelation, the descriptions of the Battle of Armageddon, it talks about birds eating dead bodies, okay? And if you read Ezekiel 38:39, that's there as well, and those details match. It also talks about things like, this is the battle to end all battles in Ezekiel 38 and 39. So that tells me it must be the last battle in some places. But the way I see it, I think it describes Armageddon, but I think there's another war. If you read Revelation carefully, it talks about that after the millennium, that Satan is released, and there's another rebellion, and that's actually the final war. And it calls it Gog and Magog.
So Armageddon is prior to the millennium, and then we've got the final appearance of Gog and Magog after the millennium.
Yeah, if you look at the classic dispensational look, and I think it's just a plain, straightforward reading of Revelation chapter 20, that you see Jesus comes back, he conquers, that's Armageddon. Then there's 1,000 years of peace. Whether that's literally 1,000 years is not totally essential. It could mean a long period of time. I don't know. But then it says that Satan will be released again, and that there will be another rebellion after Jesus has ruled on earth. It's kind of unbelievable.
I know, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around.
But apparently it happens, and there's some people that still haven't gotten it, but then after that it's the final cleanup, and that's when it says even Hades gets thrown into the lake of fire, which is another interesting concept, that Hades, like what we think of where people go now, is almost a temporary holding tank for the ultimate judgment.
Well, Hades was referred to by the Greeks as an entity. Is it possible that Hades in the Bible that is not a place but a fallen angel, an entity?
I wouldn't see. I see its description sort of the whole seems to be sort of I see it a boat, almost geocentric, divided in some way. One part sort of commonly referred to as Abraham's bosom, another one, and I think that we can essentially describe it as the place where the dead are right now. But that's not certainly not a forte of mine, but that's just what I get out of it.
Well, in Revelation it says that one of the riders on the horses is death, and Hades
Hades follows. Certainly, I think that death and Hades follow with them. I would say that certainly could be viewed in light of I think possibly the Antichrist false prophet situation, but and that is the function of what they're doing. But you got me on that.
Just a thought. We got some questions coming in at the chat room from the chat room at blogtalkradio.com/PID radio. What about the influence on current governments, human governments, of the entities that Paul referred to in Ephesians chapter 6 as principalities and powers. Are events being directed by them? Do we see world leaders doing things at the direction or the leading of these so-called powers and principalities?
Directly and indirectly. I think that the most obvious way to argue for that, and I absolutely think it's true. Now, whether they're getting direct orders, from a supernatural entity, I can't say that for sure, but I suspect perhaps some of them are. But just to make the argument in a real general terms, I mean, if you look at what the Bible says about money and people who worship money, okay, it's the root of all evil. Mm-hmm. Okay, you can't serve two masters. Okay, and then you listen to Griffin's talk tonight, about these power brokers, and we know that they're all about money, right? Mm-hmm. And and if we believe what the New Testament tells us about the love of money, then they're controlled, okay, by evil. All right, and it's just as simple as that. I mean, to make the argument that these evil entities are manipulating our world. If what G. Edward Griffin told us about tonight is that these power breakers that control the money are controlling the world. Okay, there's no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. I mean that we know that's true. And now, if the Bible tells us that people who love money are controlled by evil, then there's your connection. And you can make it that simple without really getting into the occult or anything.
I do think the occult must be put in there, though. I mean, it certainly is a principle that's good and everything, but it starts out in the context, finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but principalities. And then he goes into the full armor of God, which, having your feet shod with the gospel of peace isn't going to do a whole lot of good, up against, government powers. But I think that certainly that applies. But I do think that when you see what he's trying to say there and how he sort of wraps it up with prayer against sort of it to break down the strongholds and stuff like that, I think we have to incorporate it in terms of at least spiritual aspects to some degree. But I would agree with that. But I'm sure you probably have a...
Well, I just add quickly that I think there's specific indications that this unseen spirit world absolutely affects our world today. If you go back and you look at the 1970s in Lebanon, Beirut at one time was thought to be the jewel of the Middle East, and you see indications that the Arabs are capable of accomplishing good things. And the Lebanese government, Maronite Christians, were about to ink a deal with the Israelis and really usher in an era of some type of peace. And Bashar Gamal was assassinated, plunged that region into complete chaos, which we still have not recovered from. Then you have, just a few years later, Yasser Arafat, who was a serial killer, was in exile in Tunisia. He was on his way out as a power broker, even in that region. And at the last possible minute, when he was fading into obscurity, George Herbert Walker Bush brought him back into the fold and made him an international statesman. And we are still reaping the terrible consequences of that decision. So you look at things like this that don't make sense from the perspective of a person who says this is what you need to do in order to clean up this area of the world, but this is what they did. This is the decision they made. It makes no sense, especially for a political leader who's otherwise very intelligent.
Yeah, it begs credulity to think that people get to that level of government by being fools. Mm-hmm. And so if the results of their actions don't make sense, then what they were trying to accomplish was different from what they told us.
Exactly.
Yeah. Another question from the chat room. You mentioned Syria earlier as and the link to Antiochus Epiphanes as sort of a type of Antichrist. Chat room listener asks about a theory that's been put forward by Peter Goodgame and more recently by Rob Skiba, that the Antichrist, who is referred to in Scripture as the Assyrian, or at least in prophecy it could be interpreted that the Assyrian is the Antichrist, is actually a resurrected Nimrod, Your thoughts on that, Chris White?
Well, I hate to be controversial, but I don't think.
Well, that's how we keep these shows interesting. By injecting a little. We basically agreed with each other for 75 minutes here, and if I was still in professional radio, my consultant would say this is really boring. You need to stir it up.
I would say that I believe that he's not Assyrian. I think he may be. He may actually be Assyrian in some way, but I do certainly think that he will claim to have Jewish lineage. Based on a few different things, I think that Daniel will not, the God of his fathers. I know I've heard arguments of saying that that's a plural, but we know it's Elohim. I mean, and that the only time that phrase is used 5 times it's in the Jewish context. We see in Daniel, and I believe also in Revelation, that he sets up his shop, 2 Thessalonians 2, in the temple. I mean, that could be just circumstantial evidence that he's got like a side thing going there in Jerusalem, but I think that it also makes sense in context of 2 Thessalonians 2 that when he sits in the temple, that some people are going to be on board with it, and that's why a great persecution really begins at that moment. And that's why its epicenter is Judea, and it's why we need, whoever needs to flee at that moment, because the epicenter of that and the zealousness of that really comes out of there. I personally think that's what's going on there, and I find a lot of those theories about that, and I've certainly heard a lot of the stuff that Peter Goodgame on that. I think a lot of it's really interesting, but I'm not an adherent.
I've looked at it too. A lot of the references in the prophets to the Assyrian are clearly talking about the northern kingdom who was sacked by Assyria. And like I said before, prophecy is a pattern, and there could be, an early fulfillment and a later one, and that is got plenty of precedent. So, I wouldn't rule it out. But I mean, when you see those verses about the Assyrian will be in our land, blah blah blah. I mean, that's talking about what happened when the northern kingdom was sacked. And so, I mean, clearly that it has been fulfilled once. Could it cycle back around? Possibly. The idea that it's Nimrod comes from this thing in Revelation where it talks about there'll be these kings, it sounds like one's resurrected, one who was
is not but will be.
Right.
Yeah.
That whole thing, does add some force to the idea that it's a return of somebody. I've tried to research Nimrod, and the historical records are really sketchy. We don't really have anything before the Tower of Babel. I mean, archaeology, if you look at what they do find, I mean, they find references to a guy that could be Nimrod, okay? But and there's remains of a ziggurat in the Babylon area that they think could be the Tower of Babylon.
Yeah, at Eridu.
Right.
Egyptologist David Rohl makes the case that it was the Sumerian king Enmerkar from the Sumerian king list. Right.
A lot of that's, is highly debated. And what happened, the problem with that whole Babylon area is that prior to that, the sands have shifted. So, like when it talks about Babel in Genesis, a lot of that evidence is gone probably, and it's hard to match it up. So the Nimrod theory is interesting, especially because he's the first guy to God, and God came down and confused the languages because of him. It makes a neat package to think. If you look at the world now, we're all going back to one language. God split everything up, and we all became separate nations. Now we're becoming one world.
Yeah.
And we're all going to speak the same language. We're all hooked up on the internet. So we've undone Babel. Okay? Doesn't that kind of make a unique little package? It comes full circle, and then God intervenes again. So, I mean, it makes for a nice, neat package.
And some have argued that when you get right down to the digital level, bits and bytes, that the fact that we've got 4 laptops here plus untold numbers of cell phones running various operating systems here, that they're on a bit and byte binary level, they're all speaking one language, regardless of what human language they're coded into. So we're already back to that stage. So as far as the timing goes, the big event that we as Christians are looking forward to, as we find another way to stir up a hornet's nest here. In your study of prophecy, Jim Fletcher, what do you see as the sequence of events? I mean, does Christ's return precede the Great Tribulation? Does it come after? Is it where do you fall on the pre, post, mid, or pan, as our friend L.A. Marzulli would say? It'll all pan out in the end.
Well, I probably will be very disappointing and become very boring now. But I normally don't assign any chronology to it. I mean, if you really ask me, I would be a pre-trib person, the traditional view. But beyond that, I don't really speculate much.
Okay, and why?
One reason is I think that people become consumed by those kinds of questions, and they really get enmeshed in those kinds of discussions, and you sort of then don't see the forest for the trees. You lose the big picture that the Lord, the Creator, is returning to rescue the planet. That's the issue. The timing chronology, in my view, is somewhat secondary.
Okay. Chris White, your thoughts?
I think that the rapture and the day of the Lord, the resurrection and the day of the Lord, are back-to-back events. I think that the New Testament it makes the New Testament come alive if you make those two things happen. You don't put a space between the rapture and the day of the Lord. It makes everything stop contradicting itself. All of a sudden, you can look forward to the day of the Lord, and it's the final time that everybody's going to get punished. The wicked are going to get punished. All of it makes sense. I think that in terms of hermeneutics, I came to the Lord because probably Chuck Missler's teaching too. All my favorite teachers are pre-trib, but I believe that the hermeneutic that they taught me makes me pre-wrath in my view of how it all lays out, and that just essentially means that we don't go through any wrath. We are out of here right before the day of the Lord hits. I think that that essentially means that the sixth seal is when the rapture happens, and that's where I'm at as far as the chronology on it. I would be happy to go into all the details. I do think it's important, though. I did a recent study in this, and I also really don't want to cause anybody to stumble with any of this stuff, and so it's been something that I didn't really consider much. I was sort of like, look, maybe one of the reasons we're all fighting about it is because we don't have all the answers and stuff like that, and I still think that that's partially true. But as I started to look at it and started to question things like imminence, and really realize what I knew about imminence and, expectancy versus imminence, and do those verses mean that nothing need precede the rapture? Because we're essentially saying that things do need to precede. I mean, the Jewish people being in the land. I mean, is God working with Israel? Did He work with Israel in 70 A.D.? That throws it off a little bit, and we've got to incorporate some of these things. I think that Paul couldn't have been any more clear about that, and I just encourage anybody about that one thing. If the rapture and the day of the Lord are back-to-back events, read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians again, and it starts to make sense, in my opinion.
I agree with Chris in the large part. I mean, I don't argue the timing of the rapture either. I think that it's mysterious for purpose. There's a lot of tension in the Bible, and this is the reason why this debate has gone on. There's a lot of verses that tell you that you should expect Jesus to show up at any time. Okay, and those verses are all there. Mm-hmm. Okay, and there's a lot of verses that make it sound like a lot of stuff has to happen first, and those verses are there. Now, I don't think that that's a contradiction. I think it's a mystery. Okay, and I think it's intentional. One thing that Chuck Missler teaches is that, there's this idea that there's a certain number of the elect that God's going to bring in, and at that point, a bell goes off, and the jig's up, okay, and the Lord's going to return. And there's some good scriptures to believe that maybe that's what it means. And if so, the way Chuck describes it, Satan is like sitting there about to have a heart attack every time someone gets saved. But, and if, that it's an entertaining thought. But, okay, if that's the case, Satan reads these prophecies too. right? So, maybe God has incorporated some mystery in there to keep him guessing, as the timing. Maybe the timing's not there for a purpose. Maybe it's mysterious for a purpose. Maybe that's part of God's plan. Maybe it's not supposed to be, the timeline's not supposed to be there crystal clear. That makes sense to me strategically on God's part. And if you look at Matthew 24, this is where people that are post-trib would say, it says right here that, he's going to gather his elect up, and then the Son of Man will be coming in on the clouds of glory, and that sounds like it happens at the end. But there's other places where it doesn't sound that way. And I think that's intentional. I really do. I think it's supposed to be mysterious.
Well, that's a really good point, and that was a question I was going to ask, so I'm glad you got to that, because you're right. If we understood it all, certainly the enemy, who's far older and more intelligent than we are, would certainly know the day or the hour.
I may add one more point that I meant to add. What I was saying before is that I think that what got me, when I was doing that study, to realize that it may be a more important issue than I was thinking, is that if I was wrong, then it would mean that the church would see the Antichrist. And the fallout from that is that would make a lot of the things about deception start to come alive a little bit more. If we're teaching that no matter what, you guys aren't going to see the Antichrist, then if the Antichrist shows up, you've told everybody, don't worry about that guy. And if this deception is really good, then we need to at least consider it, because that is a big deal. And at first I thought, hey, look, people can believe what they want. And I still think whoever is saved is not going to be deceived by this. It's just not possible. Yet, I think that a good majority of those that apostatize because of this are going to do so because, well, I don't know what the numbers are, but I think at least in large part is because they are going to believe the Antichrist line, whatever that may be.
We're talking about prophecy and apologetics here on A View from the Bunker, live from Branson, Missouri for the Future Congress on emerging threats and challenges. Our guests, Jim Fletcher, prophecymatters.com, Chris Putnam, logosapologia.org, Chris White, nowheretorunradio.com, also David Icke, debunked.com. Well worth visiting that site. We talk a lot about prophecy, and as you mentioned, Jim, there are a lot of us who can let our particular interpretation sort of overwhelm the rest of our walk and our witness in our desire to prove that while our opinions may change, the fact that we were right has not. But why is it if it causes division, then why is it important for us to study to try to understand prophecy?
Well, I think it's such a dominant theme about a particular period of history. David Lewis was a great Bible prophecy teacher, and David made a statement to me one time that I've never forgotten. He said, I think that prophecy is given to us not so that we can predict what is going to happen, but so that we can understand events as they unfold. And I think that the study of prophecy helps humans understand where they are and ultimately not to be afraid and to see that the Lord really is in control.
I'd like to talk about 2 Peter chapter 1. Okay, there's this whole section. We did not follow cleverly devised myths when made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus. He's talking about being eyewitnesses to Jesus in this passage. Okay, he talks about he saw the transfiguration, and he mentions that specifically. He heard a voice from heaven say, "This is my beloved Son." And he talks about I've seen all that. Okay, but then in verse 19 we have this extraordinary passage. He says, "Okay, he's heard a voice from heaven." From God, okay, authenticate Jesus. But then he says, we have something more sure, okay, more sure than eyewitness of the Father, the prophetic word, to which you will do well to pay attention as a lamp shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. Knowing this, first of all, that no prophecy of Scripture comes from someone's own interpretation. For no prophecy was ever produced by the will of man, but men spoke from God as they carried along by the Holy Spirit. See, he talks about the word of prophecy being more sure than his own eyewitness of the Transfiguration. That's astounding.
What? And that harkens back. Well, go ahead, Chris White.
No, that's good. You go.
Well, there was a standard established for prophets in the Old Testament, and basically it was if they spoke and claimed it was the Lord speaking through them and they were wrong,
They got stoned.
They got stoned, and we don't mean in the Bob Dylan sense. This relates to a question from the chat room. Are there prophets in the end times?
I would say yes. Paul says to desire prophecy, above all other gifts, but I don't see any prophets in the same Old Testament sense as there are. I don't expect any prophets like that, possibly the two witnesses.
I agree. You have to remember, we have this Western conception of the word prophet and prophecy. A lot of it, we think of it as someone who predicts the future. In the Old Testament, prophets were people who spoke for God. And they were covenant enforcers. That was kind of the role of the Old Testament prophet. So do we have people today that speak for God? In a sense, yeah. I mean, I think that, a solid pastor is a prophet in a lot of ways. But, is he a prophet in the sense of an Isaiah or a Jeremiah? Not necessarily like that. I don't think that we see that kind of, literally speaking the word of God like inspired scripture. But we do have people in a prophetic role that, so it's a qualified yes.
Jim, what are your thoughts on that?
Boy, I couldn't be more articulate than those two answers. That really spot on.
Well, that's an interesting definition. There are those who claim a gift of prophecy now, and who are demonstrably wrong. And you will find them, and I won't name websites or anything like that, but you can find them posting predictions at various news lists around the internet. What do we make of those who claim a gift of prophecy but then add disclaimers that the prediction may not always be true, it may not take place this year, it might be several years down the road, and God might change his mind after he told me to say this? I mean, what do we make? Do they fit the definition then of prophet?
Absolutely not. Just completely dismiss that.
I have to say that I have not seen one yet that didn't make me twitchy. I mean, I've seen ones that I'm like, I haven't found the thing yet. Somewhere in here must be the thing. And those, I think that there's some that seem really, really doctrinally good, and I just have to basically just be reticent and like, okay, well, I don't think a true person with a strong gift of prophecy really advertises themselves in that capacity, but then I don't know. There might be.
Your seamer was kind of tingling.
Yeah, I'm really sort of, I don't know what to say, but I know that most of the ones that people send me are definitely off, and it's like, he predicted an earthquake in Chile, or I think there's going to be an earthquake, somewhere where the two faults come together and they're active all the time, and then sometime in the next 30 years,
Yeah.
I'm trying to be, kind and loving, and kind of curb my natural response. And on top of that, it's getting late in the evening here, and the coffee's worn off, so the brain is kind of shutting down a little bit. Jim Fletcher, in your studies, what are some of the prophecies? Well, let me back up a second. What was it that led you to study prophecy?
It was the existence of Israel. It was, again, I go back to that. It's always my main theme. The preservation of those people against all odds really points to a supernatural source. I have a good friend who's has a really thriving Christian business, and this is how he came to the Lord. He said he was a skeptic, he was an atheist, until he confronted Bible prophecy, and he said, I could not explain my way out of that. And so I think, again, now his particular avenue was the 300 Messianic prophecies of the Old Testament, which is an extremely powerful evangelistic tool. But again, for me, it's the existence of Israel, and there are so many details and so many remarkable aspects of their story in the last 63 years that you simply can't explain other than a supernatural source was present. One of the things I always remember that Dave Hunt taught is, and he was really addressing this to the skeptic, he said, please explain to me the international obsession over Jerusalem apart from the Bible. And you really can't.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, yeah, strategically, it's not really located in any great spot. There's no natural resources there that you could claim. Yeah, you're right.
Exactly. But the Lord specifically said that at the time of the end, the world, all the nations, were going to be obsessed with not just the Jews, but the status of Jerusalem. And here we are, burdensome stone.
Yeah. What do you see as the most significant, compelling, or surprising prophecy that you've encountered in your studies?
Wow.
Toss that open to the room here. Anybody?
I would go with Isaiah 53 that Chris Wright was reading from earlier. I mean, that one is astounding to me. It's one of the ones that really convinced me. If you read Isaiah 53 carefully and then compare it to the story of Jesus in the Gospels, and it's just it's very convincing.
One that I just stumbled across in my daily reading here very recently is Isaiah, and I forget if it's 43, 44, 45, but it's in there somewhere, where he specifically mentions the king of Persia by name, Cyrus.
Calls him by name 150 years before he was born.
Right. I mean, for me, I find that pretty compelling.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'll go with that one, yeah.
So at this stage of history, then, what do we see coming in the near future, and this can be whether it's drawn from prophecy or just drawn from an analysis of what we see in the news right now that may have some prophetic impact. Just as it may be a thought starter, I interviewed recently Tom Paine, who's the author of a book called The Template of Time. A very fascinating book, far too complex to delve into here in a moment, but basically he says what he sees in Scripture, and not necessarily prophetically, is an imminent war with Syria.
I might suggest and throw this out there just as so maybe get something started there, is that from my study of the New Age and stuff, they are, I say they, it's really not there's not really a headquarters or anything, but some of the original writers like Helena Blavatsky, Alice Bailey specifically, talked, and she's very influential in, what we see today in terms of the United Nations and a lot of things there, but she talked all the time about how war was so necessary for the kingdom that she was setting up, the order out of chaos thing. She talked about it constantly. I mean, she was influential, obviously, in the first United Nations and stuff like that, but she was very, very particular about how the world teacher, the Christ, as she called him, and how he was going to institute this new world religion. And this is back in the 20s, when she's writing this. And we don't trust anything. Obviously, she's... A demon was saying this through her. I mean, she called him Dejwa Kul, long story, and you can't trust anything a demon says, but you can back engineer some of the deception to a degree. My point is that it's possible that war is coming, and that's what I would say was the next thing on the timeline. I personally think that after sort of listening to what they're saying, and I talk with New Agers all the time and see where the heart is going, and it really feels like if a war happens with against the Muslims and the Jews, and the Christians are drawn in because of whatever. It doesn't matter how. If it's big and it's bloody, that's all that's really needed for Satan. Because I think that he can eventually point to that and say, look what your believing in the Bible has done. And we've talked a lot in this conference about, potential deceptions and things that will make everybody throw away God. Alien thing is mentioned a lot of times. If the end of that war, if that war could come in conjunction with something that gives everybody in the world, from the farmer to the factory worker to the ivory towers, a tangible reason to say, oh, we don't have to believe this anymore. Aliens, this is all over. And you know what? This was the reason why my kids are, sent off to war and died too. This is killing us. And let's look at history. And all of a sudden, you've got an option for this impossible thing to happen. People killing Christians for Jesus' name's sake. I think that the wars and the things Jesus says, you're going to see wars and rumors of wars, but be careful, because the end is not yet. I'm thinking that what they're going to do is crush that system and say, look at our new utopia, a world without religion. But there's some cleanup we need to do. Mm-hmm. There's some people that still kind of cling on to this old thing, and you guys want to evolve into this new thing. I think we need to be prepared for this deception that could be a part of that afterwards.
That is a tremendous point, and my mind goes to the fact that even the emergents have an eschatology. They have a view of where history is going. And theirs is not so different from that. They believe that we are sort of headed toward an omega point, and there will be a purifying process, and then we will emerge into utopia. And that's what they're working for. And so, Rob Bell believes his frame of reference for Christianity is he calls it an Eastern religion. I mean, they're kind of there in a lot of ways in their thinking, and so this group that you're talking about that wants to usher in this era of utopia, it's very real to them. It's a very real belief system.
That has an interesting touch point to the chapter that I wrote in Pandemonium's Engine on Christian transhumanism. This whole concept of transhumanism is a utopian vision for the future. And the technologies are falling into place now. They're talking about life extension therapies where they can live forever, talking about modifying themselves with biotechnology, reversing aging, becoming smarter. All these things. And this is, you have materialistic atheist scientists, and this is their eschatology, okay? They want to create utopia through pharmacology, through technology. All of these things are converging, okay? You have the New Agers, you have, the situation. As far as Bible prophecy and all those things, Israel is where it's all centered. The Bible couldn't be any clearer about that. And, if you look at the powers of evil and evil in the world, you have to ask yourself, World War II, why was Hitler so focused on the Jews? Why did he pick the Jews? Mm-hmm. If you look at what did Moses tell the Jews, if you go away from me, you're going to be cursed by all peoples. You're going to be hated. He talks about your bodies are going to be laying in fields and vultures will be feeding. That's in Deuteronomy. Mm-hmm. That sounds like the Holocaust in Deuteronomy. He said, you'll be a byword among the nations, a curse. Okay? And that's Moses. Okay? And we've seen that all throughout history. That authenticates the Bible right there. It's funny that the enemies of the Bible authenticate it with all their actions, even when they're trying to disbelieve it.
And it's an excellent point that Jim has made a couple of times here tonight. Like, what other ancient people still exist today in the face of that persecution? And what about the other enemies of the Assyrians? Where are the Moabites today? The Ammonites, the Edomites. Where are they today? You mentioned the Great Deception, and Jesus talks about that. That would deceive even the elect if that were possible. Chris, you hinted at one. Just thoughts. What would the Great Deception look like? Or could it look like? Alien deception? Are we talking about perhaps the emergent church and a deception that draws Christians into believing that our true mission on planet Earth is to just be loving and accepting of everybody regardless of what they believe?
I think that you were absolutely right in pointing out the emergent church connection. I think it's indicative of what's happening. It's not the New Age. It's not militant atheism. It's not ecumenicalism with the Roman Catholic Church or emergent churchism. It's those things are just Satan modifying his tactic to a particular person's paradigm. He's doing the same thing in everything. He's drawing the world to getting ready to make his bid to force them all to worship him. It's just the only game in town. The only conspiracy that there is the Antichrist needs stuff in order to make that one thing happen. And so that certain people, the emergent church people, are people that would not pay attention to 90% of the deceptions out there, the straight up New Age stuff that I deal with, or the occult stuff, or the stuff that everybody is out there fighting. But it's everywhere. It's this non-centralized, and the reason it works is because he does have people or entities, I believe, that are driving the agenda from the spiritual realm all to the same place, kind of converging on the same basic thing. To answer the question about what it looks like, I think that in Matthew 24, parallel passages or whatever, it's almost like you see in the book of Hebrews or whatever. There's a deception. False teachers are involved. but it's also in the context of persecution. So, like, the apostasy is like a two-edged sword. You know, you there's an alternative spirituality out there that's available, and it sounds okay, and we can take that road, and everybody's doing it. And then if we don't, there's persecution and death on this side too. So it's like I don't want that, and that. So I feel like that's it's just like in the book of Hebrews. There's persecution or the threat of persecution, and then also the false teaching.
And hand in hand with the persecution of the Jews and the target of Satan against the Jews, what is the common hatred among all of these people? 2 Peter chapter 3. Where is the promise of His coming? The return of the Creator to earth is an absolutely despised worldview by these people, and yet they, by their scoffing, fulfill the very prophecy they deny. And this is in the church. If there's something that I underestimated as a young man, was the full scope of apostasy in the church. And it's astonishing to see some of the things going on today that I never would have believed, frankly, that I would live to see.
We've got a question here that's been asked not only in the chat room, but from this lovely lady here in the sitting here in the room with us. So I guess I'd better ask it now. It's I think one that's been debated for probably the last 2,000 years, ever since John the Revelator wrote it down. Who, what, or where is Mystery Babylon?
Well,
it's been debated for 2,000 years. We're going to solve it here in the last 10 minutes and 26 seconds.
I'll venture just one theory and it's the one that Dr. Heiser talks about in Islam and Armageddon, and he argues that it's kind of a confederation of the nations around Israel.
Mystery Babylon being the confederation of the nations around Israel.
And I'm not saying that's what it is for sure, but I think that he makes a very compelling argument in that book. If you look at what Armageddon is, it's converging on Jerusalem, really, and that's where the Battle of Armageddon occurs. And so, if you look at who is going to be those forces coming against them, it would be a confederation of Muslim nations right now. It would also coincide with the Psalm 83 and the Ezekiel 38, 39 paradigm, and that just makes sense to me. I see that, and so that very well it's a good guess.
Okay, Jim, you want to take a stab at that one?
Well, I think it's a very good guess. Babylon has always existed as the dark alternative to Jerusalem, God's city, and of course we know that the genesis, if you will, of all the evil worldviews and doctrines, teachings came out of the Babylonian system, and so it's just a convergence of all these false views that I think you're right, culminating in a look toward the destruction of the Jewish state.
Oh man!
And Chris is trying to find a proof text here.
I got some. This is almost all proof text up here about that particular question, and I got this.
And for those of you listening in the chat room, he's got a Bible there with little colored sticky tabs out the top of the Bible, and there are probably about 4 dozen different colored sticky tabs there.
I really dropped this thing because I was just like, wow, there's so much in here. I eventually. It's like, okay, I don't, whatever. But I think that we know it's a city. I think we've got to remember the context here. She is riding the beast. 7 heads, 10 horns. We see that in Revelation 13. It's the Antichrist. She is riding the Antichrist. The Antichrist later on turns around and kills her.
Yeah.
She if she's the mother of all evil in the world, and then the Antichrist destroys her, which is sort of like defeating itself, But I would say there's one thing. I'll just say I think it's, and I'll say this very carefully: the eschatological city of Jerusalem, not Jerusalem now, not Jerusalem whatever, but the Jerusalem that promotes the Antichrist as if he is the Messiah, and that is why the kings of the earth, just like, are coming and giving them gifts. And a big thing to do with this is mystery. We always kind of insert the word all harlots. It calls Jerusalem the mother of harlots several places. It is the mother. You are the mother of harlots. The harlots are how many places can you name just right now that he specifically calls, God specifically calls Jerusalem, harlots, the city, and I know that there are other cases. He calls Babylon a harlot. He calls Tyre a harlot. They are, and we see here that she has the form of she doesn't have a husband. She says, it's a sense that she once was in a favored relationship with God. The big proof text, the problem with this is Zechariah 14, where it comes into.
Before you close that, I want to ask you a question about this.
Sure.
Keep that verse marked there.
Well, I don't want to go into Zechariah 14 right now because we would definitely be here for a while. But the chronology in that is very interesting. I think it really has a lot to do with those days at the end of Armageddon. There's the 35 and the anyway. What was your question?
The verse and the reference there to the 7 hills.
Yes, I think that's the crucial part of that.
Would you mind reading it?
Yeah. Okay. I think we should back up here. Here's the mind that has. Okay, let me start back here. The beast that you saw was and is not will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was, is not, and yet is. Here's the mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. This version says there are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. The beast that was and is not himself, also the 8th, and is of the 7 and is going to perdition. Sounds real confusing.
Yeah.
And I think that if you look, I think this is all in context defining what those 7 mountains are. They're not hills. If we wanted to say hills, we would have said hills. They're mountains, which we know this head that gets in Revelation 13 that gets wounded. It's one of those heads of the Antichrist. And if you take in this 5 have fallen, 1 is, and 1 that isn't, and we know that everybody takes in the spirit of Antichrist verses, that the spirit of Antichrist has been in the world. It's been acting and manifests in a king over time. You can, with not going into anything else, you don't know anything about the Roman Catholic Church or anything else, just with the Bible, you can find 5 totally, Nebuchadnezzar, a big thing. He forces everybody to worship the image of him. If they don't worship the image of him, they throw him
in the oven.
Right.
Yeah.
We can find 5 of those guys that are clear. I can rattle off a few of them here, but one that is Nero and one that is yet to come. That one that is yet to come is going to, we read 13, he's going to die, but he's coming back. That's how he can be the 8th, but never stop being the 7th.
Right.
And so that solves a million heresies right there. But the problem, go ahead.
No, I was the reason I brought that up, and we've got about 4 minutes left here. I want to throw you guys a curveball on this particular verse with the 7 mountains. One of the issues that Sharon and I have talked a lot about on PID Radio in recent months is dominion theology, kingdom now theology, which essentially says that we Christians, especially the self-appointed prophets, capital P prophet, capital A apostle, with all the power and authority of the biblical prophets and apostles, will serve as God's government over planet Earth, and the mandate on which they justify this belief is the 7 mountains mandate. They believe that there are 7 mountains of culture that they need to claim to reclaim planet Earth and prepare the way for the return of Jesus Christ. And it was such a shock when I first learned about the 7 mountains mandate. It's like, have they not read the book of Revelation? Is it possible that the 7 mountains on which the harlot builds her city there, the Mystery Babylon, is actually this belief of evangelical Christians who think they've got a mandate from God to conquer the earth?
And look at the divergent groups within the church today that normally would never have anything to do with each other, but on this one issue of dominionist theology, they all are coming together
to create one
mainline evangelical, charismatic, you name it.
It seems to me that could be another prime example of this idea that prophecy is a pattern and not just a strict linear relationship. It could be more than one thing, because it does seem to match that. Yet, there could be merit to multiple of these theories, and they could converge.
If this is their proof text for that, then I don't know.
See, that's the thing. They don't reference that. That's the thing. It's like they just pretend it's not there. But then their eschatology doesn't depend on Jesus coming down and himself, taking out the unbelievers. It's our job to do it, and that's a topic for another show.
Post-millennial.
Yeah. And we're down to just the last couple of minutes. very quickly, if you could just take, say, half a minute or so, as Christians, Chris White, our responsibility to read and understand prophecy, again, just to kind of reiterate in about half a minute, why is it important for us to study it, or what do you see as the most important thing for us to look at when we're studying prophecy?
I think that the primary word that I would say is deception. The reason the Lord speaks so much about it, he starts off and ends, don't be deceived. Everything that he's saying is in the context of don't let them get you on this one. It's going to be really, really good. And so I think that's part of it. I think that the other part of it is all the stuff we've talked about in terms of evangelism and stuff like that. Evangelism isn't necessarily handing out tracts. It's just, solving people's problems. Yep. And I think that prophecy is one aspect to sort of get a person to the point, help them problems.
Well, my passion is apologetics, and I just would like to encourage everyone, to have reasons to give to people for why you believe what you believe. Arguments from prophecy are really good. As far as end times things, I think that what we see there is the opposite of what Dominionists say, and that we can expect to see persecution. We can expect to be marginalized increasingly in our culture, as intolerant, as bigoted. You can expect these things. And so you really do need to get some skills in apologetics to be able to defend what it is you believe.
All right, just about 20 seconds, Jim Fletcher.
Prophecy is important because it shows us clearly that God keeps his promises every time. And that's important to us corporately, but also as individuals. And that's something that we can show people that we can really hang our hat on.
Jim Fletcher, ProphecyMatters.com, Chris Putnam, LogosApologia.org, Chris White, NowhereToRunRadio.com. I'm Derek Gilbert. Tomorrow night, Jeff Patty, Rob Skiba, and Russ Dizdar live, 10 p.m. Central Time, blogtalkradio.com/PID Radio. Until then, remember, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, and this is A View from the Bunker.